At the height of World War I, as America was fighting a war that was promoted as safeguarding freedoms, democracy, and human rights, a man was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for simply giving a speech. For criticizing the war, he was breaking the law. 2, actually, and sent to jail. But his popularity only rose for his stance against that war, even running for president from prison. And as the nation was sending millions of young men to fight and die for freedom overseas, it was also sending some men and women behind bars for exercising basic democratic rights that America was founded upon and prized itself on. But just what propelled the progressive and idealistic Wilson administration to repress dissent so fiercely? And was this necessary to protect the nation during wartime? Well, that's just the treasure we're out to discover. I'm Dan Luer, and this is History for Humans. Eugene Debs, the man arrested for delivering that anti-war speech, was born in a small town of Indiana in the year 1885. He attended public school until the age of 14 when he left to work in a train factory for 50 cents a day. And it didn't take long for the young man to radicalize and begin fighting for the working man against what he felt was the cold injustice of the capitalist system. He became active in organized labor and was an editor for a union publication when he was still young. And he continued to rise up in the ranks of unions when they themselves were rising in America. In 1893, he became president of the American Railway Union and helped to organize some of the nation's biggest strikes during the Gilded Age. And he was arrested for his work organizing the Pullman strike. And while he was serving time in prison, he educated himself on the teachings of Karl Marx and then declared himself a socialist in 1897. Out of prison, he helped to found the Socialist Party of America and ran for president 3 times before America entered the Great War. And it will be that war and the hypocrisy that he found in it that our story lecture is focused on today. But lest we go any further, our exploration question for today's story lecture is, how were Americans impacted at home by World War I, and what impact did it have on civil liberties? So see where the details of this story fit into that frame. But umbrellas out, y'all, I got some history to write upon you first. So in late 1917, America declared war, and though the country had previously been divided, patriotism soared with enthusiastic excitement for war. War tends to rally folks around the flag, but remember, Wilson was reelected on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," and there were still many Americans who continued to feel that this was not America's fight. So as the Wilson administration began mobilizing the military for war overseas, getting our troops and Navy trained and ready to fight, they also were mobilizing a Homefront campaign to sell the war like a used Oldsmobile. George Neal headed the Committee of Public Information, and this committee's goal was simple: to build support for the war effort. So one of the first things he did was hire many former progressive muckrakers and journalists in order to write stories and create posters to sell the war as a patriotic necessity. They needed to sell this as a war not just to protect America from German aggression, but as a war to fight for American principles and its high ideals, to give Americans something to fight for and to rally behind. And there were 2 slogans to do this that were as American as apple pie and potato guns. And they were to make the world safe for democracy and a war to end all wars.
Mr. Luer, isn't this World War I, and Wilson was fighting to end all wars? I'm guessing this didn't quite work out for him with, World War II and all.
Yes, Kalohe, exactly. It was just a slogan, and it was a damn good one. But you're going to have to wait for the last story in this series to see how Wilson hoped to end all wars. And in his speech to Congress about the need to fight this war to protect human rights and democratic principles in the world, he also promised to deal with disloyalty with a firm hand of stern repression, a promise he certainly made good on. So Congress responded by passing the Espionage and then Sedition Acts, which made it illegal to interfere with the draft, criticizing the government or the war, and it was enforced with fines up to $10,000 and 20 years in jail. It made it illegal to interfere with the selling of war bonds, which helped the government finance the war. Liberty bonds, even in their very name, appealed to the patriotic nature of Americans to loan the government money that will be then paid back after the war with interest. The Committee of Public Information also used propaganda to demonize the Germans, highlighting the threats they posed, and used figures like good old Uncle Sam and this classic poster to get Americans to join the military, conserve food, grow victory gardens, and to support limitations on their freedoms to help win the war. And those are all ways that Americans at home were encouraged and indeed did support the war effort. But it was the passing of the Espionage and Sedition Acts that so sickened Debs that he went on a mission to challenge them, defend his rights, and dare the government to come after him. Eugene Debs was against the war from the very beginning. As a socialist, he believed that the European imperial powers were fighting this war for a simple reason: to further enrich the capitalist elite class and use the working class as fodder to die at their command. And he didn't buy into Wilson's slogans, believing America too was out to protect its own business interests. But when Congress passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts, he seemed to be doubly sickened, and socialists like him were the easiest targets. Socialist papers across the country were shut down. Many leading socialists were arrested for protesting the war, including his closest friend and leading feminist Kate O'Hare, who was sentenced to 5 years for an anti-war speech. With so many of his friends and peers behind bars, Debs began to feel guilty being free. When those who spoke out against the horrors of the war were considered criminals, he grew embarrassed by it. So Debs went on a speaking tour across the Midwest to rally opposition against the war right as American troops were just fighting in their first battles and helping to turn the tide of war for the Allies. And therefore, this was also a time when so many Americans were rallying support for those soldiers and patriotism was at its height. But that didn't deter Debs. He had always been a fiery speaker, and he could memorize crowds with his words, his passion, and his message. So when he came to Canton, Ohio in June of 1918 and spoke, he aimed to convince Americans of the need to bring those troops home and to encourage others not to join the war and resist the draft. It was a hot summer day. Still, Debs wore his classic heavy tweed jacket, buttoned up vest, sweat pouring off his massive forehead. He rose to the bandstand in front of the crowd of over 1,000 people who were leaning in to hear his words. Amongst the crowd, federal agents circled, and a stenographer working for prosecutors began typing furiously, capturing Debs' every word as he fired off against the war. Knowing that the federal government was after him, he did try to modify some parts of his speech in order to conform with the law, but he still dropped straight hammers from the podium like this: "Wars throughout history have been waged for conquest and plunder. They have always taught and trained you to believe that it is your patriotic duty to go to war and have yourself slaughtered at their command. But in all the history of the world, the people have never had a voice in declaring war. And strange as it certainly appears, no war by any nation in any age has ever been declared by the people. Yours not to reason why, yours but to do and die." As he rattled off, the stenographer could hardly believe how subversive his words were, especially with those agents in the crowd. In his speech, he challenged the view that those protesting the war were traitors and unpatriotic, and he argued that the real traitors were those that were sending men to die in the fields, hiding behind the flag, but really had their eyes gleaming for gold and glory. In his 2-hour-long speech, he also spent much of the time defending and promoting socialism. He praised the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, led by Lenin, as the first real democracy.
So Debs here is raging against America's repression of dissent, but praising the Bolsheviks, who are creating one of the most repressive regimes in human history. As a free speech absolutist, my mood is starting to sour on Mr. Eugene Debs.
You're right, Manao. He was praising Lenin's leadership right as he was starting to carry out the Red Terror and murdering and terrorizing his political enemies. That went well beyond Wilson's darkest dreams would have ever approached. But it shows how complicated the figures of history are, and probably how complicated we ourselves are. But nonetheless, then Debs wrapped up his speech in Canton, the crowd burning with energy, angry fists waving against America's war machine and revolution in their hearts. The federal agents eyed him closely as he backed away from the podium. The crowd dispersed, and then so did Debs. He left that day a free man, but would not remain so for long. As the war went on, so too did the war for the hearts and minds of the American people to unite behind the effort. The war really revolutionized the use of government propaganda with new mass media. Posters and pamphlets, and 75,000 4-minute men were hired to make short speeches at theaters and parades and town halls to raise support and money for the war effort. As radio and true mass communication were still a few years away, these 4-minute men reached millions of Americans, appealing to their patriotic nature to support the war. And the Espionage and Sedition Acts were challenged in the courts. I mean, could it really be constitutional to make it a crime to simply speak out and protest things specifically protected in the First Amendment? I mean, it's the first one, not like the 7th, whatever that one's about. Oh, one of those boring ones about your rights in court or something? Anyway, on 3 different occasions, the Supreme Court upheld these restrictions on free speech during wartime. In Schenck v. the United States, Justice Oliver Holmes famously cited restrictions could be made on speech when there is a clear and present danger of that speech, like shouting fire in a crowded theater. The argument was speech that was critical of the war could put our country in danger, since it could undermine our efforts in winning this most dreadful war. But the problem here, as far as I see it, was that there was a real fire, and young men were being sent into into it, whether you supported the war or not. Now, did speaking against the war and the drafting of young men put them into greater danger? I don't know, but as far as the Supreme Court saw it, it did. And Debs was about to account for it. It was 2 weeks after his Canton, Ohio speech when Debs was at a socialist picnic in Cleveland, still on his speaking tour, when federal agents arrested him. He was charged with 10 accounts of violating the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Once in cuffs, Debs stated, "I thank the capitalist masters for putting me here." He wrote, "They know where I belong. Under their criminal and corrupting system, it is the only compliment they could pay me." He was already embracing the role of the martyr. In court, prosecutors argued that he was encouraging protests and obstructing the draft, which I feel is putting it mildly. And Debs himself actually celebrated doing so. He spoke on his own behalf and forcibly admitted it, that he hated war and needed to fight against it. Debs was found guilty finally on 3 accounts and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. His imprisonment was cheered by the press and much of the public, but it only seemed to increase his popularity across the country. He would run again for president on the socialist ticket in the 1920 election as convict number 9652 and got nearly 1 million votes. And after serving 2.5 years of his term, the new Republican president, Harding, commuted his sentence and invited him to the White House. They met briefly and then Debs went on his way. For the remainder of his life, Debs continued fighting for the working men and women of this country, and his dream of a socialist utopia would not play out the way he imagined it in the decades after his death in 1926. And even though the war ended in 1918, the Sedition Act was not repealed until the last year of Wilson's administration in 1920, while components of the Espionage Act remain in law today. And the ideas surrounding Debs' speech continue to be debated in the country and represent the line between our freedoms, our national security, and governmental power. For me, I'm grateful for the sacrifices of the soldiers and also for those who fought for their rights that are guaranteed by the Constitution, even when it meant jail. And now I leave you with the duty to consider whether you feel Debs was a hero or whether the government was right to repress certain rights during the war. Because I promise it's a lesson that this country is going to continue to wrestle with for a long while. So thanks for engaging in history today. This has been History for Humans. Hey, super small favor to ask you guys. If you like what we're doing here at History for Humans, it would be awesome if you clicked and showed it and subscribed. You can comment below and let us know what you feel about Debs and Wilson during the war. And you can also head over to our website where we have resources and where you can join in the conversation with other students around the country. And if you're doing the learning activity, hang out because we got instructions in just a second. Okay, for today's lesson, you're going to need to get on your thinking hats. Actually, no, wait, helmets, because I'm telling you, it's going to get heavy in here. What you're going to be thinking about is this. Can speech actually cause serious threats to national security and therefore should be limited at certain times? Or should free speech be guaranteed no matter what? There are 2 parts to this lesson. First, you're going to read 4 different primary sources, 4 documents. There are some comprehension questions on the side. You're going to answer those. And then you're going to be building evidence for and against arresting Emma Goldman, who, like Debs, was arrested during the war for criticizing it. So you're going to find evidence from the sources, but then you can also use your own ideas and own opinions on the matter. And after considering the evidence for and against it, you're going to do a writing piece where you argue whether she should have been locked up for her speech or she should be set free. So read the arguments and the documents carefully, think critically, and act like geologists on this one and rock it.